Hello, and welcome back to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 7th of May. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 438 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guests for this afternoon, and then together we will take a look at the past week's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The head of the UN's nuclear power watchdog warned yesterday that the situation around the Russian-held Zaporizhia nuclear power station has become potentially dangerous as Moscow-installed officials began evacuating people from nearby areas. Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, called for measures to ensure the safe operation of Europe's largest nuclear power plant. No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Fine. It's fine. Called for measures to ensure the safe operation of Europe's largest nuclear power plant as evacuations were underway in the nearby town of Enerhodar. There were blasts in Russia-annexed Crimea early on Sunday, according to Russian and Ukrainian media. Russian social media reported air defense systems were repelling attacks. It was reported that Ukraine sent drones into the Crimean Peninsula, with Russian air defense shooting down at least one over the port of Sevastopol. There were no reports of casualties. A prominent Russian nationalist writer, Zakir Prilepin, was wounded in a car bombing that killed his driver. The attack took place on Saturday in the Nizhny Novgorod region, about 250 miles east of Moscow. Russia's foreign ministry accused Ukraine, while Ukraine's security services refused to confirm or deny their involvement. A senior Ukrainian official accused Russia of staging the attack. Ukrainian officials issued air raid alerts on Saturday evening for areas covering about two-thirds of the country. The alerts extended from the capital, Kyiv, and regions to the west of it, through all regions in the east, as well as south to Kherson and Russian-annexed Crimea. Ukraine has hailed the return of 45 Azov battalion fighters captured during the battle for Mariupol, while Russia has said that 3 of its pilots have been released by Kyiv. The freed Ukrainian prisoners include 42 men and 3 women from the Azov battalion. Russia has been accused of attacking the besieged city of Bakhmut with white phosphorus incendiary weapons. Ukraine's Air Force claims to have downed a Russian hypersonic missile over Kyiv using a newly acquired American Patriot defense system, the first time the country has been able to intercept one of Moscow's most modern missiles. Russian shelling killed 6 Ukrainian demining experts in the southern Kherson region, Ukrainian emergency services have said. Some residents of the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson have left before a 56-hour curfew came into effect on Friday. The curfew, which lasts until Monday morning, has prompted speculation that the city could be at the centre of a Ukrainian counter-attack. Concerns in the Russian leadership about vulnerability to attack and the potential for public protests over the Ukraine war have contributed to the decision to cancel many Victory Day parades, the UK Ministry of Defence has said. 6 Russian regions occupied Crimea and 21 cities have cancelled their parades this coming Tuesday, said the MOD. Russia is still not satisfied with how the issue of Russian grain agricultural exports as part of the Black Sea grain deal is being resolved following the latest talks with UN officials. Poland's ambassador to the EU has said that Poland will demand European Union sanctions on imports of Russian farm products. And Switzerland's parliament has approved a request from Ukrainian authorities for Volodymyr Zelensky to address it. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined today by 2 regular contributors to Broadcasting Scotland. We're bringing a dream team back together again for the first time, I think, since the 22nd of January. Martyn Day became the elected Member of Parliament for the Linlithgow and East Falkirk constituency at the election on the 7th of May 2015. He was re-elected at the snap election in June 2017 and at the Brexit general election held on the 12th of December 2019. Prior to his political career, Martyn worked for the Bank of Scotland as a personal banking manager. Martyn, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Not bad. I'm full of the joys of life and had a wee extra energy boost from the wonderful demonstration that happened in Glasgow yesterday. I think it's put a bit of fire back into our movement.
That's great. Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh Marshall was the founder of the National Wales, Anwen Wales and Talking Wales, which is a new national news service for Wales. He's also an expert in digital strategy, content creation and marketing support. He's a regular contributor to Broadcasting Scotland, providing the view from Cymru. Hugh, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Branda, I'm absolutely full of coronation quiche.
Well, and all the better for it, and I'm absolutely sure. And it's as well that you mentioned the coronation quiche, Hugh, because we've all been coronated. UK citizens have officially become the subjects of King Charles III, his heirs and spaniels. An estimated £100 million was spent on lavish celebrations to crown the king, while services in Scotland, which offered support to people struggling to afford the basics, for them it was business as usual. At a food bank in Glasgow South East on Friday afternoon, volunteers were busy distributing bags of toilet rolls, tinned and fresh food, shampoo and other essential items. The manager, Audrey Flanagan, said that in the first year, 12 years ago, they helped around 700 people, but this year they have fed more than 11,500. At another food bank in Glasgow, at Carntine and Ridley, they were supplying food and essentials to around 600 people. Of course, in that constituency, the average life expectancy for a man is one of the lowest in Scotland at 72 years, 2 years shorter than the age of King Charles now. The manager of that food bank, John Lyons, said that people who are on benefits cannot afford the prices of what they are being asked to pay now. Asked what would help solve the crisis, he said, get rid of the 2% that hold the wealth and redistribute it. He also said that as many enjoy the coronation bank holiday tomorrow, his food bank will be open as normal because poverty does not take a day off, he said. So, Martyn, firstly, how happy should we be at the spectacle and cost of the coronation yesterday? And that estimate of £100 million feels very light to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something. The coronation thing is not something that gets me excited, irrespective of whether it's like a modest or. Yep. Is that any better sound-wise? Yep. Okay. Yeah, I think irrespective of focus or Republican or apathetic issue, the stark reality is a sort of trimmed down coronation is going to be, in real terms, more than twice as expensive as the previous queen's. So, that I think puts it into perspective, and what the final cost is, we'll have to wait and see. But the ABC News were reporting $125 million as the likely price, well over £100 million in pounds sterling, and that money could have been much better spent. Even if it had been a cut down coronation, the equivalent cost in today's money for the 1953 one is estimated to have been $46 million. So it's significantly more expensive, more than twice the price of the one that went before. So it's not cut down, but the reality is people are having to cut back on essentials. Cutting back on food or heating. I've been out knocking doors in my constituency, and the big issue is energy costs. So people are feeling the pinch, and I think whatever your views on the monarchy is, that lavish display is just inappropriate in the current circumstances.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, some journalist outlets have suggested that this regal event has allowed the population to pack up their troubles for the weekend and embrace a welcome distraction from their day-to-day woes, letting them Google and goggle at their supposed betters in all their finery. Now, talking for a moment about those who seem to consider themselves better than the rest of us, I think we need to give a big shout out to Liz Truss at the coronation yesterday, looking just like an actor who appeared in one episode of Doctor Who and yet is now attending Comic Cons for the rest of her life. And also, of course, the English Environment Minister, Therese Coffey, described on Twitter as Nellie the Effluent, dressed like she tripped and fell into a skip behind the Oxfam shop. But putting those two appearances to one side, Hugh, do you think an event like the one which played out yesterday in Westminster, does it provide a distraction, and maybe in some ways a sense of community? Or on the other hand, does it simply serve to remind taxpayers to remember their place in life, remember their station, and not to forget it?
Yeah, it's a massive dead cat, isn't it? It was when you think about the local election result in England on Thursday. All of a sudden, that's been forgotten that the Conservatives lost over 1,000 councillors in England, and that was after the worst local election results the previous time. But it was on the television here. I was working. My daughter was watching it because it's a historic occasion. But I heard Kirsty Walk discuss with her guests about the pared back, whether the balance had been struck correctly. Well, from the footage I've seen, I can't see where they have pared back. You know what I mean? It was it was lavish, gold plates, staffs with jewels in that would feed the hungry for many months and years. And I think hopefully it's the last time we see something of that kind. Because the reality is the coronation could have been done quietly, privately, with the royal family, and just get it done with. But it's a sense, I think, of Prince Charles, who is now King Charles, that he's obviously been waiting for this moment for many years. So I think it's years of built up suppressed emotions from him that he is finally king. And again, the way that Camilla, the third person that Princess Diana referred to, is now the queen, and the way that the media are portraying her as, a new person. It's just all a bit bizarre, isn't it? But hopefully, this is the last time. I moved to the valley in Pontycymer, where I live now, about 20 years ago. And previously, when any royal events, the valleys in South Wales have always been sort of staunch royalists living here, and the village is usually bedecked out in Union Jacks. This time, I passed one house that had Union Jacks and stuff on, and ironically, that was a Labour county councillor's house.
We shouldn't be surprised by that at all, Hugh. And a good point about the pared back. I noticed that Bloomberg estimate that the value of the crown that Queen Camilla was wearing yesterday is £5 billion. But we'll put that to one side because around the country, the coronation was shown on big screens. At the Ross Bandstand, there were a small number of people turning out in Edinburgh to watch it. Among those watching on that big screen was a chap, Ewan Carr, who said, "I don't give a shit about the royals in general." And he told the National, but he said he fancied being outside, and this seemed like more fun. Asked whether he thinks the royal family will survive following the death of the Queen, he said, sadly, yes, the UK is incapable of reform. He said that Scottish independence is the only way the UK will change in any way, and that was one of the reasons making me vote for it in the first place, he said. But sadly, we are stuck with him. So, Martyn, firstly, while yesterday seems to be largely about looking backwards, for a moment, let's look to the future if we can. What do you think? What should be the role and means of selection of a head of state for an independent Scotland, or Wales for that matter? Might we, for example, take inspiration from Ireland?
Yeah, I think we can take inspiration from pretty much most countries in the world. It's not even a question of, as I say, whether you want to be a monarchy or a republic. If you look around Europe as a prime example, where there are several other monarchies, none of them have anything like the status and pomp that we have here. They're much more limited, and they have clear, ceremonial roles. So, you could have a very different monarchy system, or you could have a complete republic. If you were creating a system from scratch, you certainly wouldn't introduce a heredity principle as the basis for your head of state. That's just bonkers. I go to a good dentist, I go to a good set of doctors, but I wouldn't go to somebody just because they were hereditary down the same line as someone else. So you pick the right person for the job that you're doing. And that's exactly what we should do with every tier of government. And the head of state is no different from that, in my opinion.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, the same question for you. Looking forwards rather than backwards, what do you think should be the role and means of selection of a head of state for an independent Scotland or Wales?
Yeah, this is something that is discussed and debated. I'm a Republican, but I can see there are some people who would want to continue with the royal family as the heads of states of an independent Scotland and Wales, and that's something that can only be decided at the ballot box after independence has been secured. But as I say, if you look at Ireland, if you look at other countries, having a head of state, because it makes you wonder: do you actually need a head of state, in this day and age? One thing that struck me yesterday was Princess Anne was trending on Twitter because she was riding her horse at her age, because obviously she's older than Charles, and the reality is it should have been Anne being crowned queen yesterday, because she's the eldest, but because of old traditions and whatnot, then that didn't happen. So they need to modernise. It needs slimming back. You can see that the mood has changed amongst young people. Young people now, they don't see what's going, what the point of the royal family. And I think the fact that Harry and Meghan, have been vilified by the right wing media, are quite popular with younger people, as opposed to the older generation. That there's a complete sort of juxtaposition between young and old today. So, but like I say, after we gain independence, put it to the people. Whether they decide whether they want to keep the king, whether they want an elected head of state, or whether they don't want a head of state at all.
Thanks, Hugh. And Martyn, that individual who gave an interview to the National, who was talking about, who said sadly, yes, the UK is incapable of reform. Do you think that there is, with this transition in the royal family, do you think that there is how do you think are the chances for reform? For example, moving to the sort of model that you were discussing a moment ago, the kind of bicycling monarchies that we see in Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands?
I think I'm probably in agreement with what Hugh said there. They do seem incapable of change. Any change moves a glacial pace in the UK, and the reality is, I think events are overtaking the pace of change. People are probably going to decide for themselves at a date not that distance. I think we've seen the bonds that attach people to the monarchy have loosened following the death of the Queen, who was highly respected. I think Charles is perhaps more respected by the older generation than the younger one, and whether there's any future after Charles for the monarchy is a question that we wait to see the answer to. So I think change will come. It will come fairly quickly with independence, but I think if we wait for the UK, there's, to use an expression, there's just too many forelock tuggers that are interested in a bit of ceremony and pomp and feeling important by being on the fringes of other events, that change just doesn't happen. Look how long we waited for Lord's reform, and it's glacial, so we shouldn't be surprised that change doesn't come quickly.
No, that's a very good point, Martyn. As we comment fairly regularly here, the Labour Party has been promising to abolish the House of Lords for more than a century. And there's no sign of any progress on that. But I wanted with you two gentlemen to have a look at the events of yesterday from a slightly different perspective as well, because Scotland Yard has been accused of an incredibly alarming attack on the right to protest after the police used new powers to arrest the head of the leading Republican movement and other organisers of an approved demonstration just hours before the coronation. Excuse me. Graham Smith, who's the chief executive of Republic, had been collecting drinks and placards from demonstrators at the main site of protest at Trafalgar Square 2 hours before the King was due to arrive at the Abbey, when he was stopped with 5 others by police. The group had been walking behind a rental van which contained hundreds of placards, but they were approached by the police and searched. A video of an exchange with one of those arrested was caught on film. One police officer can be heard saying, "I'm not going to get into a conversation about that. They are under arrest." End of. The Metropolitan Police later said that 52 arrests had been made for affray, public order offences, breach of the peace, and conspiracy to cause a public nuisance around the coronation. Yasmin Ahmed, the UK director of Human Rights Watch, condemned the arrests, saying the reports of people being arrested for peacefully protesting against the coronation are incredibly alarming. This is something you would expect to see in Moscow, not London. And Sasha Desmukh, Amnesty International's UK chief executive, said the human rights group had been concerned about the Met statements about its low tolerance of protests. He said, "We need to see what details emerge around these incidents, but merely being in possession of a megaphone or carrying placards should never be grounds for an arrest." Peaceful protest, he went on, is clearly protected under international human rights, and it's been worrying to see the police this week making numerous statements about their low tolerance for disrupting the coronation. The coronation shouldn't become yet another excuse for undermining people's basic human rights in this country. So, Martyn, firstly with you, should we be surprised at all at the Met demonstrating its self-proclaimed low tolerance of peaceful protests? The Met, of course, does have a very high tolerance for institutional racism, law-breaking by its own officers, sexism, bullying, misogyny, and homophobia, and that's at least according to the report by Baroness Casey. So should we be surprised at the way in which the Met has been behaving this week?
I don't think we should be surprised, and indeed we've warned repeatedly from Parliament as we saw the legislation becoming increasingly more fascist in terms of how it deals with protests in the UK. And while justice is a devolved matter, the reality is, while we're part of the UK, there will always be Scots wanting to protest at Parliament in London. So our citizens fall under this draconian laws as well, and I do think it has been extremely heavily handed the way it's been dealt with. Now, I can see the other side of the coin as well, because one of the key components of policing has to be to maintain sort of public safety and a public order. But I don't see any evidence that the people who've been arrested were a risk to either of those situations. So it does feel heavy-handed. Now, if people were going to do something that might have spooked the horses or caused a civil unrest with the royalist supporters that were there, then I think, perhaps action could be justified, but it just seems far too heavy-handed.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, the same question for you. Should we be surprised at all that the Met demonstrating its self-proclaimed low tolerance of what most of us seem to think would be legal, peaceful protests?
No, when you've got somebody like Suella Braverman in government, this is what you should expect. But one of the interesting stories that broke on the radio was the arrest of 3 people in Soho at 2 a.m. on Sunday. I don't know, again, Martyn was referencing the horses for people because they'd had intelligence that people were going to use rape alarms to scare, the horses. They had intelligence. So they arrested 3 people. The journalist Mick Wright, Broken Bottle Boy on Twitter, if you follow him, he was actually he visited the people in the police station, and they were actually people who actually work with the police, handing out rape alarms to people late at night. So, this shows you how something, that's gone wrong. They've arrested clearly, the wrong people. They've been released now without charge. But still, the news were reporting it as, intelligence. There was no such intelligence. They arrested people because they had rape alarms on them. And they put 2 and 2 together and thought they were up to no good. Where the reality was they were actually, from an organisation who cooperate with the police, but obviously different parts of the police. But no, it was. Peter Tatchell was saying, that they agreed all these things 2 days beforehand, but they obviously arrested people prior to the protest, and the area where they'd agreed for them to be able to hold their protest, they'd erected a 20-foot high barrier to make sure that the king wouldn't be able to see them. So again, it's chipping away. And my concern is, if Keir Starmer becomes the next prime minister, will he be rolling these things back? because he seems to be aping the extreme elements of the Conservatives when it comes to law and order, because he wants to be seen as being tough on crime. So I'd like to hear from him this week saying, if I get into power, this is what I'm going to do. But I'll be holding my breath because you never hear anything policy-wise coming out of his mouth at the moment because he's waiting until there's a general election called.
That's a very good point, Hugh. As we well know, and there's plenty of examples, once a right is taken away from people, it's very difficult to have it restored. And Martyn, Hugh was mentioning Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary there, and we'll be talking about Police Scotland later on in this programme. Do you think, from the evidence of the behaviour of elements of the Metropolitan Police yesterday, do you think is there a hint here that some sections in the police feel that they are being they are being encouraged in their behaviour and encouraged in their approach by a Home Secretary who seems determined to take away human rights left, right, and centre?
That's certainly a distinct possibility. I mean, Braverman is I thought Patel was the most right-wing Home Secretary we could ever have had, and they managed to top that by bringing Braverman, and we just took it to an even more toxic and abhorrent level. So yes, we've seen, certainly in connection with the Met Police, so many concerns about their mode of operation over a sustained number of years. So there are elements within the police that would probably take advantage of that situation that she has now created. There are, of course, other elements that are perfectly decent and honourable police, and hopefully they get the upper hand and we get a much better form of policing coming out. But the legislation certainly puts a squeeze on people's human rights and the right to protest, and that is, in my opinion, very, very concerning.
Thanks, Martyn. I remember thinking that Theresa May was the most right-wing Home Secretary I'd ever known. Shows how little I know. But Hugh, the protest, which numbered around 2,000, drew many well-known characters from the anti-monarchy movement, including Patrick Thelwell, who was found guilty last month of a public order offence for throwing 5 eggs at the King during his visit to York. As King Charles was being anointed and crowned in the Abbey, Thelwell was seized from the crowd by the police, handcuffed and searched on suspicion of having prohibited items. He said, "They saw me from their watchtower, and next minute I was in handcuffs and being searched on suspicion of having eggs, I suppose. I didn't have anything in my pockets apart from condoms and a lighter, so they had to let me go. I've absolutely not brought any eggs," he added. "My parole officer tells me counter-terrorism police are following me." So if it's true what Patrick Thelwell said about his surveillance and his treatment yesterday, Hugh, should we all be concerned?
Well, most definitely. There was a counter-protest in Cardiff yesterday, and looking at, again, on Twitter to journalists, they were estimating that there was roughly the same amount of people on the protest that there were in the castle watching on a big screen. So, it wasn't a huge protest because there wasn't a huge turnout in the castle, but, they were using facial recognition. So I assume, that's how they've managed to spot these people. And I can see people saying, if there's a terrorist threat, with a suicide bomber or something like that. But if you've got somebody who, has got a track record of throwing eggs at people, that's where you've got to start worrying. I think there are more important elements out there that the police need to be dealing with, rather than people who, at the end of the day, just don't want to see the monarchy anymore.
Thanks, Hugh. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, we're also going to talk this afternoon about Police Scotland, not the Met for a moment. And what I'm about to read is reporting from the Times. So apologies in advance for the clunkingly awful use of the language. The report was that Britain's FBI was drafted in by Scottish police to help with their investigation into the SNP's finances. Officers from the National Crime Agency, which leads the fight to cut serious and organised crime, were commissioned several months ago before Nicola Sturgeon's husband, Peter Morrell, was arrested. The specialist team were asked to assess the progress of the investigation, bringing a fresh pair of eyes to the evidence collected and to identify any possible lines of inquiry. The officers, likely to have been financial crime experts, conducted a peer review of the operation over several weeks between October and December last year. Revelations that the Scottish force sought its help came as more details emerged about evidence seizures. Items on a police warrant, which is said to be 100 pages long, reportedly included a woman's razor and a wheelbarrow. Now, just to clear that up for a moment, as I say, that's reporting from the Times, and there's no evidence whatsoever in the public domain about any seizures, and the leak appears to be suggesting what was on a search warrant, not a police warrant. But having put that to one side, Martyn, firstly with you, should we be concerned at this bizarre list of objects allegedly connected to supposed crimes for which no charges have been brought, and some say are unlikely to be forthcoming? And should we be concerned now that it seems that the UK's National Crime Agency are also involved in the investigation?
It seems very bizarre all round, and while I wouldn't want to get into the details of discussing a live police investigation, I don't think that's helpful. The sort of farcical nature of the forensic tent that we saw on the TV and the hunt for a razor and a wheelbarrow, I think we can conclusively conclude that not one of the missing 30,000 members were found buried in the garden. So it is just bonkersness. And I think I find myself in agreement with the comments that Murray Foote made the other day about it being a grotesque circus. And that certainly is what it appears to be. Now, whether the National Crime Agency's involvement is a good thing or a bad thing, I remain to be convinced on. But if it helps get through this process a bit quicker by bringing other bodies in and a bit of scrutiny, then maybe that's not a bad thing at the end of the day. And the sooner we get past this, the better.
That's a good point, Martyn. A bit of perspective, perhaps, in Police Scotland, who, as you say, have been determined to progress this investigation in a manner the like of which I don't think any of us have ever seen before. Hugh, from your perspective outside Scotland, what are you making of the reporting of and as Martyn rightly points out, the current live investigation into the SNP's finances and the arrest and then discharge without any charges being made of Peter Morrell and the SNP's one-time finance lead?
Yeah, as Martyn said, you don't want to comment on the ins and outs of an ongoing police investigation. But as Martyn said, this just needs to get concluded as soon as possible, so we can just get an answer. Has something happened or not? Because as long as this goes on, what we're seeing in the media is conjecture, tittle tattle. Somebody did this, somebody potentially did that. And it's just not healthy for politics. The cynic in me would suggest that there's an element of this from the media that they want to try and damage the SNP prior to a general election that's coming up in a relatively short space of time. But I think having read quite a few commentaries from Scotland, there's a huge risk of this backfiring on them and actually ending up sort of bolstering the SNP and support for independence. But anything that allows this to come to a conclusion. But there is now, I'm afraid, an element of mistrust when it comes to the police, wherever they are. When I was running the National, we had stories there about South Wales Police, about sort of investigations that were going on around the police. Those have been well documented. So it's not something that's people concerned about what's been happening in the Met. I think it's just in general around the police. And it was interesting, that there was a big hoo-ha fanfare about the government's pledge to recruit 20,000 new police officers. And, they were saying that they'd succeeded in doing this. But what they didn't say was how many people, how many police officers they actually got rid of prior to that target. And the fact now that we've lost a lot of experienced police officers, and the police force now has a lot of younger, inexperienced people in there, which which potentially offers concerns moving forward.
Thanks, Hugh. And Martyn, the MSP Jamie Dornan, who represents the next door constituency to Nicola Sturgeon's constituency, has also condemned the police operation, which is apparently called Operation Branchform. Jamie said, seriously, who is in charge of this fiasco? Who ordered it to happen? And if or when we find that nothing untoward happened, who is going to be held accountable? And that was what he was writing on social media. He said, this public parody of policing would never have happened to a prime minister or ex-prime minister, so why was it okayed in Scotland? And of course, after the arrest of Peter Murrell last month, a senior SNP official said that the behaviour of the police in the investigation was disproportionate and, quote, stinks, unquote. So, Martyn, does Jamie Dornan have a point?
I think these are very valid points to make, although I do think the correct time to make them is after we've got the conclusion of the investigation and we know exactly what the facts are. There will, I think, inevitably be a reckoning of some sort. Either some wrongdoing's been done and actions taken, or there's been an unfounded witch hunt and action needs taken. So, we need to get to the end of the investigation to find out which route we're going down.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, thinking you were talking there about your experience with South Wales Police, we've been talking this afternoon about the Met, specifically about their conduct yesterday, but also in a more general context of the Met's approach to policing over many years. And also we're now talking about Police Scotland. Do you think that there's a risk, at least, of an indication here that in some respects the actions of the police are becoming politicised?
I think yesterday made that clear for me. They were saying that the decisions they took around the coronation were ones taken themselves, but the fact that it's sort of mimicking the view of the Home Secretary, it really does cause concern, and it's one of the things that policing isn't evolved in Wales, and obviously Scotland has its own laws, and I think that's one of the key steps I think for Wales from an independence perspective that needs evolving is law and policing, because as I say at the moment it's all that's been decided at Westminster, and it's what's been decided there is being enforced on us here, and it's not good news.
Thanks, Hugh. And Martyn, the same question to you. I'm reminded of both those who support independence in Scotland and those who oppose independence. Often, or not often, but they have to me said that they are concerned that the police Scotland is politicised or is under political control. Now we know that certainly all of my lifetime, there has always been political accountability of the police forces, previously to local authorities under the old system of the constabularies in Scotland, but now with a single unitary police force. So have you any concerns or views with regard to the risk of politicisation of the police?
Yeah, I mean, putting my cards on the table, it'd be fair to say that I'm a bit out of date in terms of the current scrutiny that the police in Scotland undergo. I was, in my sort of previous incarnation as a local government councillor, I was a member of the Lothian and Borders Police Board for a good number of years, and certainly there was no operational interference at any political level, but there was oversight and scrutiny. I would hope that is what has continued. I think when there is a political dimension to a crime or an accusation of a crime, then the police find themselves in a bit more of a dilemma as to how they handle it. And given the nature of media, I think it can be very difficult in some circumstances for them to handle some of these cases. So, I hope we're giving them the benefit of the doubt rather than, there is a problem,
Absolutely.
And can I just add, because in Wales we have we've got police commissioners, so I think we've got four police forces in Wales who have police commissioners who oversee them, and obviously those are politicised, because they're elected from political parties, as opposed to, you do get independent standing, but I think it's one Plaid Cymru and three Labour who oversee that. So it's clearly politicised just from that perspective, and we need to get away from this political influence in things like policing, and I think getting rid of those commissioners and going back to having some sort of representation of the people would be a far better idea.
That's a good observation, a great point. Thanks, Hugh. Let's move on, though, this afternoon, because I wanted to talk to both you gentlemen about truth and transparency in another context, because the Scottish Conservatives, also known as the Conservative Party's branch office in Scotland, held a debate at Holyrood on Wednesday, calling for the current proposed plans for highly protected marine areas to be reconsidered. That party's rural affairs spokesperson, Rachel Hamilton, yes, that Rachel Hamilton, the one fined £50,000 by the pensions regulator, claimed the current proposals put forward in relation to HPMAs from the SNP Green government would be deeply damaging for our fishing and coastal communities. It is little wonder that the sector and those communities have lined up to oppose these plans in the strongest possible terms. The Scottish Conservatives share those concerns, which is why we are forcing a vote this week in Parliament. Now, the Scottish Greens coastal spokeswoman, Ariane Burgess, said the Tories have betrayed the Scottish fishing industry time and time again, from branding it expendable when haggling fish quotas to failing to deliver promises made about the fabled benefits of Brexit. What's worse, they are happy to roll out HPMAs in England, but when it comes to Scotland, they have a different view. It really is no surprise they are failing communities and future generations again in trying to undermine another policy that can help fight climate change and biodiversity loss. In the debate on Wednesday, the First Minister reminded the Tories of their own manifesto commitment and accused Douglas Ross of flip-flopping. Let me remind him, of course, that it is a Scottish Conservative manifesto pledge to introduce highly protected marine areas, Yusuf said. In fact, Douglas Ross doesn't want to stand on one manifesto. He stood on two manifestos that wanted to introduce highly protected marine areas in some shape or form. We know Douglas Ross is known for flip-flopping all over the place on any issue of the day. Now, we shouldn't forget that Scottish Labour, or the British Labour Party's branch office in Scotland, their 2021 election manifesto made an explicit commitment to creating highly protected marine zones. It said, "We will also support a plan for ocean recovery with at least 1/10 of Scotland's seas fully protected and a further 20% highly protected from destructive and extractive activities by 2030. So, Martyn, the three main parties in the Scottish Parliament each had highly protected marine areas in their last manifestos, but apparently now they're a problem. What's going on?
Well, obviously I'm not in the Scottish Parliament, so I'm aware of the issue in sort of general terms. It's not one I'm fully conversant in, but clearly there's a lot of political expediency and double standards in display. I think the important thing, whatever someone's views on the highly protected marine areas, is that there's a proper consultation underway, and I think we need to wait and see the outcome of that. But we do need openness and honesty from our politicians, and not just playing cheap political shots and going back on what they've promised the voters in their own manifestos. I think that's the least we can expect.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martyn. And looking at transparency from another perspective, Hugh, Gordon Brown's think tank, Our Scottish Future, and the campaign group, Kevin Haig's campaign group, These Islands, are among groups that have been named and shamed for their secrecy around who funds them. The pro-union Scottish Business UK and the Centre for the Union were also given the lowest possible score in a new report listing the transparency of various think tanks and campaign groups. Reform Scotland, the think tank chaired by the former Labour First Minister Jack McConnell, was also given the lowest possible grade. These scores come from a report by Open Democracy, which has graded think tanks from A to E in a newly published Who Funds You audit. Open Democracy said that the audit showed that more than a quarter of the money that has been donated to think tanks focused on the devolved areas of the UK can be considered dark money. However, the 4 unionist groups given the lowest E grade do not disclose even how much funding they are in receipt of, meaning it's impossible to know the actual true figures. So, Hugh, what do you think unionist groups have to hide about who donates to them and where that money comes from?
Well, I think you've answered the question there. Where is this money coming from? Because clearly it's not coming from donations from locals. Otherwise, they'd be happy to declare it. I think we're quite fortunate in Wales is that we don't have a plethora of Tufton Street sort of think tanks operating here. They do have Welsh arms, that sort of extend into Wales. But because devolution here is limited in its capacity, it's not that much of an interest. Interestingly, a think tank set up when UKIP got elected into the Assembly, as it was, the Senedd now. It was Centre for Welsh Studies, which was rather ironic, and that was set up, by UKIP MEP, Conservative MEP and MP. So, but again, they wouldn't declare where the funding came from. And funnily enough, once UKIP stroke Brexit Party, once they were all sort of voted out from the Senedd at the last elections, the think tank came to an end. So it shows you as well, I think there's an element, there must be some redirection of political funding going into some of these organisations, and I think that's something that they want to sort of keep under wraps.
Thanks, Hugh. Absolutely. Now, Martyn, your parliamentary colleague Tommy Shepherd said the Tories have had serious questions to answer for a long time on who they are funded by. They have been surrounded by issues with dark money and foreign donations for a very long time. Yet, still, we do not have the answers to the very basic question: who funds them? Martyn, how do we even begin to clear up political funding in our politics when the party in power has been surrounded by issues with dark money and foreign donations for a very long time?
I mean, just the other week, the UK Parliament missed its opportunity to do just that very thing with the National Security Bill, and there were amendments there that would have made quite a difference in terms of funding. That obviously the government did not accept those. And that just speaks volumes that they're quite happy with that trail of dark money continuing. And I think you need to put it into a bit of perspective as well, because the perspective is truly frightening. Some, collectively good, bad and indifferent in terms of, the transparency of think tanks. Collectively, think tanks spend around 14 or 15 million a year in the UK. And if you think of a UK general election, 650 constituencies, very tight, very organised spending rules and declarations that have to be made by candidates. The winning candidates for those 650 constituencies will spend less than that amount spent by think tanks in a year. So that puts it in perspective as to how this can potentially undermine our democracy. Now, the good news is most organisations are transparent, and I think we should also reward good behaviour, and we need to say, groups like Business for Scotland and the Common Wheel were given A ratings. We have to be better than our opponents, and we're demonstrating that in so many ways. But we need to find out where the dark money is coming from. And, there are so many loopholes that need tidied up. I mean, you can have a UK registered business which may not be making any profits from its trading, but that fact that it's a registered business can then donate whatever it likes to a political party or cause. So even the rules we have where there is a degree of transparency aren't good enough. And we've got all these other organisations where we have no idea whatsoever where their funding's coming from.
Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, just to tie together 2 or 3 of the items we've been discussing so far this afternoon, we've commented that Police Scotland were determined to park what might be described as a Taggart tribute tent on Peter Morrell and Nicola Sturgeon's front garden, but have done nothing in response to repeated complaints about dark funding for right-wing propaganda units. So do you think, are there double standards at play here, Hugh?
Well, yeah, when you think about, that they managed to arrest people for, prior to them actually doing anything. So it wasn't like that, they had done anything. They were arresting them in case they were going to do it. And, I think we've seen from, the Carol Vorderman's campaign, is trying to get justice around Michelle Mone, the great Scottish member of the House of Lords. There's obviously, something, sort of going wrong here. When you look at COVID and what was going on in 10 Downing Street, it's ludicrous that, so little came from, what was going on there, because obviously it's come out now that, what was going on there. It was a really serious matter. And I think, it's difficult when you've got in Westminster, the committees have got limited powers in what they can investigate as well. So again, that's something that needs to be looked at, at all levels of government, in Westminster and in the devolved areas, as to what they can actually investigate themselves. Because I think there's a concern. There have been instances in Wales of some questionable activity. And it just basically hasn't been looked into properly. So, and that's why people want to ask questions, and that's one of the reasons as well, is why things like this program is so important. Is where are those spaces in the media that these things can be discussed? Because currently, there isn't enough of a space to actually question governments, and holding them to account, and that includes, the SNP government in Scotland.
Thanks, Hugh. And there was one other story this week that we should touch on, because that's the results of the English local elections show a swing to Labour, but not enough for an outright victory at the next general election. So Anas Sarwar has been accused of staggering hypocrisy after hailing Tory councillors losing seats in England, while of course his party relies on their support throughout Scotland. The Scottish Labour leader was accused of doing nothing about his councillors who have entered into backroom deals with the Conservatives in local authorities across Scotland, despite a pre-election pledge last year that his party would do no deals with any others. Labour councillors have helped the Conservatives into power in South Ayrshire, Moray, and struck deals with Tories and other parties across the country to keep the SNP out in other areas such as Edinburgh and Fife. Tommy Shepherd, the SNP MP for Edinburgh East, said the hypocrisy of all this is quite staggering. On one hand, Anas Sarwar heaps praise on Labour for removing Tory councillors across England, while in Scotland he proudly watches on as his councillors stand side by side with them. He went on with Labour lurching further and further to the right and U-turning on countless manifesto commitments. The choice facing people in Scotland could not be clearer. And Kate Campbell, the SNP councillor for Portobello Craigmillar, pointed out at an Edinburgh Council meeting this week, in February, the Labour group in Edinburgh voted with the Tories for a Lib Dem budget, privatising services and ending a policy of no compulsory redundancies. And earlier this week, Labour voted to put Tories and Liberal Democrats into power in Edinburgh. Apparently for Scottish Labour, she said, the union is more important than social justice. So, firstly, Martyn, is the approach taken by Anas Sarwar further evidence that the unionist parties, now all but indistinguishable from each other, have started cannibalising their voters?
Yeah, I think we've seen that in the last few elections. We saw that with the transfers between the unionist parties at the council elections last year, and we saw it with tactical voting at the Scottish Parliament the year before that. Starmer, of course, is stealing ever more of the Tories' clothes, and they are very rapidly becoming completely indistinguishable from one another. The real change will come through having a strong SNP at Westminster and delivering independence in Scotland, because it's quite clear that both parties are morphing further and further to the right. The whole axis of UK politics is drifting to the right, and that is not the direction of Scotland's social democracy, which makes getting out of it ever more important to us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Martyn. And Hugh, some people say that you can already see signs of deals, for example, in Edinburgh West and Edinburgh South. So the unionist parties only put up one candidate between them, or one real candidate, and are entering into private backroom election deals. Do you think that there's a risk that that kind of approach is going to expand in Scotland? And also, thinking of the success that Plaid Cymru is having, do you think there's a chance that the Unionist forces are going to begin to organise and polarise the elections in Wales as well?
I think it's interesting, and this is where the differences between Wales and Scotland become clear. If you think about, in Scotland, the SNP are seen as a progressive party, and who support independence, whereas Labour in Scotland are seen as being unionist and happy to work with Conservatives. In Wales, Labour have been the dominant force for many years. We've never had a Conservative majority elected in any shape or form in Wales, and they are, seen as a progressive socialist party. Mark Drakeford, who's the leader of the Labour in Wales, who's the First Minister, was a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. So there's big differences there, and I think it shows that it's the fact that the SNP is strong in Scotland that makes a difference, and the fact that Plaid Cymru is still only managing to sort of attract 20% of the vote, despite sort of support for independence growing, not hugely. I think it's about 1 in 3 now. When you go back, only about 10, 20 years, it was 1 in 10. So it is growing, but that doesn't seem to be converting to people voting for Plaid Cymru. And unfortunately, this week, Plaid Cymru has been in the news for the wrong reasons, because they published a report that they commissioned themselves into bullying allegations within the party. And the report that was carried out by former Plaid politician Nerys Evans, it was quite damning in what they discovered. The party's, putting all those things forward, but there is pressure now on Adam Price as a leader to take responsibility for, what's contained in the report. So, it's the strength of the parties that makes the difference. And, in Wales, I don't think unionism doesn't quite trump enough for, Labour and Conservatives to go into cahoots. And the Conservatives here are lurching even further to the right. Their leader is just, all he does is tweet about small votes, and he's just seen as a bit of a laughing stock now.
Absolutely, Hugh. That's fantastic perspective from Cymru. Thank you very much indeed. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the generous support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can continue to pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland in any way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back on Monday evening at 7 for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching this afternoon, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guests, Hugh Marshall and Martyn Day MP. Thanks, guys.
No problem.
Yeah.
I hope that you enjoyed our programme today and that you have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.